So, I need a minute. I'll get out of my Elmo voice. Let's close our, open our hearts, open our minds, get ready to receive the Word of God. Amen. So at school, when we get back from Christmas in 4th grade in math, January is fraction time. That's when I start teaching fractions. And I know most of you probably didn't wake up this morning and think, gee, I hope Kevin talks about 4th grade math today during the sermon. But I promise you there's a point. And some of you might even see it eventually. But anyway, one of the hardest things about fractions, one of the hardest concepts with fractions is renaming them and reducing them. And you have to understand this in order to subtract and add fractions. And you have to know that 1/2 is equal to 3/6 and 1/4 is equal to 2/8, and you have to understand those concepts. And so I pull in a concept that we learned earlier in the year, and so they can make a connection and build on their prior knowledge to understand this idea. Sandy and Lauren, did I throw enough educational words in there to pique your interest? Okay. Good. Oh, and then you have to differentiate when you're done. Multiple intelligences. Right. We could go on and on. I could do a whole sermon on and not say a single thing except for educational buzzwords. But the concept that I pull in from the very beginning of the year is called the identity property of multiplication. Now, I never learned that when I was in school. At least I didn't learn the name of it, so don't feel lost if you have never heard of it either. But yeah, it's called the identity property of multiplication. And the concept is really easy. In fact, it's so easy, it's one of those things that it's so easy the kids don't understand the whole point of it because it's so easy. The identity property basically says that if you multiply a number by 1, the answer is the other number. So 7 times 1 is 7, 8 times 1 is 7, 300 times 300, 300 times 1 is 300. So that's the identity property. And so I use that to teach fractions. And so I show the kids, this is actually what I was doing at school when I was writing this sermon. So you show the kids, you see like 1/2 times 3/3, which is really 1, equals 2/4. And 3/4 times 3/3, which is really 1, equals 9/12. And so it's an easy way for them to see that you're changing the look of the fraction, but it still has the same identity. 1/2 and 2/4 have the same identity because you're just multiplying by 1. Now, I brought some papers here. I'm going to do a quiz here on this in a moment, but any questions? Good. Okay, moving on. But this can be this concept that fractions can look different, but yet be the same. They can look different and have the same identity. That can be confusing for kids. And it can be confusing for adults too. When I teach this concept to them, I always use the concept of, or the idea, example of superheroes. And that usually works. Now, I mentioned a few weeks ago that I'm only going to use sophisticated examples from now on, like British PBS shows. But here I am, I'm going to use superheroes again. Okay? And there will be a Lord of the Rings example here later in the sermon as well, for those of you that are hoping for that. Okay, so I tell my students that Clark Kent Clark Kent has this amazing disguise. It's amazing. He wears glasses. And I didn't notice until I put this picture on, but he does something else too. His hair is part on the other side. I never realized that until now. So at first I thought, oh, how stupid, he just has glasses. But when you put the glasses and the hair part, it makes total sense. So it's pretty obvious that that's a great disguise. But the point is, his identity is the same. You know, on one side he's Clark Kent, takes glasses off, boom, he's really Superman. People might not recognize him as Clark Kent. I mean, again, because of the hair part and the glasses. But he really is Superman. And that's his identity. That's his identity. And that's what I use to tell the kids, that numbers can have, the fractions can have different names, but have the same identity, just like Clark Kent and Superman. And this all relates to the 16th chapter in Matthew. And that's where Jesus asks his disciples to identify him. Now, by that time, Jesus had been traveling the countryside with his disciples. He'd been preaching hope to the hopeless. He'd been healing the sick. He had been reaching out to the outcasts. And he has told parables, and he has confronted and challenged the people in power. And people have begun to whisper and to talk about who this Jesus really is, and who he might be, and what he's up to. And so, in a moment, when Jesus is with his disciples, and when they're away from the crowd, he asks them, he says, "Who do people say I am? Who do people say I am?" Because the fact is, people aren't sure. They aren't sure. They don't know his identity. And it's not because he's wearing a disguise either. Or maybe he is, because he looks human. He looks like everybody else. And the disciples respond that people think that Jesus might be John the Baptist reincarnated, or Elijah, or another one of the prophets. And so Jesus continues, he pursues with another question. He says, "Well then, who do you say I am? Who do you say I am?" And Peter responds, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Now, very soon after this conversation takes place, Jesus is transfigured before Peter and James and John. And we hear God's own voice coming down from the mountain that confirms this true identity of Jesus. And this is from Matthew 17. It says, "After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah, talking with Jesus. And Peter said to Jesus, 'Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah.' And while he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them. And a voice from the cloud said, 'This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him.'" So basically, now it's out. Now it's out. The secret of Jesus' identity. It's like that moment when Superman or Clark Kent takes off his glasses and reparts his hair. Suddenly they know who Jesus was. The cat was out of the bag, and his identity was shown. But this also happened when Jesus was baptized. This happened when Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. And that's the story from today's gospel lesson. And I want to read that as well. This is from Matthew chapter 3, verses 13 through 17. It says, "Then Jesus came from Galilee to the Jordan to be baptized by John. But John tried to deter him, saying, 'I need to be baptized by you. And I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me?' And Jesus replied, 'Let it be so now. It is proper for us to do this, to fulfill all righteousness.' And then John consented. As soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out of the water. At that moment, heaven was opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, 'This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased.'" Now when you look at these two passages together, there's an interesting little part after the transfiguration. So this is back to chapter 17. This is after he was transfigured. After God said, "This is my Son." So listen to that next verse after Peter, James, and John witnessed the transfiguration. It says, "As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, 'Don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead.'" Now, to me, that's interesting. Jesus was pretty much saying, keep my identity a secret. So, Jesus must have walked through the world, including trips back to his hometown and back to his home in Nazareth, to the streets that he's walked on over and over and over again, the streets of his own neighborhood, knowing who he is, but his true identity he wanted to keep secret. Who do people say I am? Who do you say I am? And later, a few of his friends were shown exactly who he was. They were shown exactly who he was up on that mountain. But they were told not to tell anyone. Think of how hard that must have been. Now, it's a common theme in literature for a character who knows his identity but cannot declare it. He has to walk through the world hidden but in plain sight. Now, in Lord of the Rings, there's a character named Strider, and he's really Aragorn, who is the heir to the kingdom of the West. And he appears to be this disheveled wanderer. He's got ragged clothes, he's got messy hair, but he's got this unbelievable 5 o'clock shadow. And underneath, he's truly the king of the West. But no one knows that. No one knows that he's really this noble and unbelievably powerful warrior, right? All that gold does not glitter. And he lives in the shadows. And he's conflicted about the discovery of his true name. And it's the same with Clark Kent. I'm sure at some point he just wanted to rip those glasses off and shout to the world who he really was. I mean, Lois Lane didn't even know who he was. And I'm sure that was very, very frustrating to him. So we have superheroes, and we have literary characters, and even Jesus walking around, but people not really knowing who they are. But what about us? What about us? What would it be like to walk through this world in this way? Hidden in plain sight. Unrecognized, even by those who know us best, or even by those who love us. Writers return to this idea again and again, not because it's some thought-provoking fiction, but because it's a genuine truth. Each one of us, we travel the streets of our hometowns like Jesus, the hallways of our workplaces, even the rooms of our very homes, with our true identities unknown, our true identities hidden, our true identities a secret. Sometimes you might hear accolades that you have received, people talking about you in wonderful ways, and you think to yourself, wow, that doesn't even sound like me. They don't know me at all. Or sometimes you might hear criticisms about you. And then you think to yourself, wow, that doesn't sound like me. These people don't know me at all. It all seems that what you hear spoken about is someone else. Some stranger who only vaguely reminds you of yourself. Now we all have those times. We all have those times when you believe if the world just knew who you really were, if the world just knew what you were really like, then everyone would love you and everyone would rejoice in you. We've all had those times where if the world knew what we were really like, then the world would shrink back in fear or disgust about who you really are. Think of those times when you want to cry out. When you want to cry out what your identity is. When you want to rip the Clark Kent glasses from your nose, or like Aragorn, emerge from the shadows and rip off the tattered clothes and comb the ragged hair and claim your true name. But we hide. We hide our identity. We hide our self-doubt. We hide our anxieties, our weaknesses, because we think that those things make us less than. We think that those things make us unlovable. But none of that is true. None of that is true. Today we're reminded about that more than ever, that there is a greater truth out there. When we read the gospel lesson, when we hear the story of Jesus being baptized, we learn that not only was Jesus baptized, but that we can be baptized in Jesus. In both passages that I read today, God spoke, and he said, "This is my Son, whom I love, and I am well pleased." A lot of other versions use the word beloved. This is my Son, the beloved. And I really like that word, beloved. And that's his true identity. That's the identity of Jesus. Beloved. Jesus is God's beloved. That is his identity. And it's not a secret. And the great news is that we can be baptized in Jesus as well. We can also have that identity. That identity is also us, God's beloved. That is our true identity as well. And it isn't a secret either. We emerge from the water. We are reborn in him. Baptism is that event where we declare, and God declares, that we no longer need Clark Kent's glasses. We no longer need to hide, or we no longer need to be confused about who we are. Because who we are, who you and I are, who we truly are the sons and daughters of God. The sons and daughters of God. That is our true identity. And that identity is more powerful than any self-doubts, more powerful than any anxieties, more powerful than any weaknesses that we might be hiding. Let me go back for a minute to that word in many translations, beloved. What a beautiful word. To be beloved is to be adored. To be beloved is to be cherished, to be treasured. And that's the promise of baptism. That is the promise that God has given to us. God is claiming us as His very own. His very own. A beloved child. And then God declaring, simply because we belong to God, that God is well pleased with us. He is well pleased with us. And that's what the gospel lesson today tells me. That's what it tells me. That I am beloved by God and that God is pleased with me. That's our identity. And we shouldn't keep it a secret. It doesn't need to be a secret. Too often our identity is based on our failures, our fears, our weaknesses. And we think that we just aren't enough to have someone pleased with us or to be beloved. But the good news is that we are. Yes, this idea comes from a verse where God says this about Jesus. But when we are baptized in Jesus, then our identity is revealed. And we realize that God feels the same way about us. We are also His beloved, and He is also pleased with us. And it even goes further because we are all in this together. We're all in this together. Not only do we belong to God, but that story of baptism shows us that we also belong to each other. That we are part of something bigger. We are all part of God's presence in this world. And that's why we come together. That's why we celebrate each other's baptisms. And that's why we remember the baptism of Jesus today. Because sometimes life is hard. Sometimes we feel like we have lost who we really are. Sometimes we might feel like no one really knows us, but God does. God does. We are not lost to Him. Our identity is not a secret to Him. That is your true identity. You are a child of God. You are beloved, and with you, God is well pleased. Amen. And as we sing our closing hymn,